In designing this presentation on accessibility, I wasn't sure who the audience would be because Drupal Hub or Drupal Govcon, it could be all over the place. A lot of developers or non-developers. So I'm just kind of curious, like how many people are developers, back end and front end. General show of hands. Are any visual designers? Sweet. Okay, that's what I'm. I'm a visual designer with front end experience. Like in the dark ages of the web, I used to have to code all my own websites, and I dealt a lot with the federal government specifically. So I was always having to do Section 508. Cool. And just kind of curious, anybody come from far out of town to attend this? That's pretty cool. Okay. I just assumed everyone was kind of local because I'm from Alexandria, and we're from Forum One Communications. We're a firm headquartered in Alexandria, Virginia. We do a ton of work with Drupal and WordPress and lots of other stuff, but obviously Drupal's our topic. I'm Daniel, a senior interaction designer. Again, I specialize in visual design, even though I do front-end coding. In creating this presentation, I noticed that Google Slide and PowerPoint is very poor accessibility, so I just kind of made my own. So this thing's all HTML, and you can check it out in your own time. It works on your phone, which is another thing that Google Slides and PowerPoint is kind of poor at. And then this stuff ends up on SlideShare, and it's like not very accessible once it goes in SlideShare. And Karen.
Hi, I'm Karen Kitchens. I'm a front-end developer with Forum One, and I'm very excited to talk to you about Drupal and 508 refresh.
Woo-hoo. So he's definitely here to help me more in the Drupal scary questions. I do all the front-end design. I don't know as much about Drupal as I would like, but all of the 508, everything you're going to learn about 508 pertains to no matter what. If you're doing WordPress, pure HTML, Drupal, it's all the same, but of course you're going to touch into what exactly you can do specifically in Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 to make your sites more accessible. So on that topic, what is accessibility? A lot of times we get client requirements that a site must be Section 508 compliant, and I like to say that Section 508 compliance is different than accessibility. That even when you're compliant with 508, you can ironically be non-accessible, and you can be accessible and ironically be non-508 compliant. The reason is because the law has a sort of disconnect with practical real-life things. This can happen many times when you try to regulate something like this, like coding standards. So we're going to be focusing on Section 508, but a key takeaway I want to have everyone to take away from this is that focus more on the accessibility, less on the letter of the law. Of course, when you're doing government sites, you absolutely have to. It's kind of a little bit a dirty trick, but a lot of 508 can't be automatically tested. So if you're worried about being 100% compliant, that may not be as necessary as just being common sense and being as compliant as you possibly can. So, and in terms of coding, accessible means that the content has to be tagged in such a way that assistive technology can see it. So a screen reader might look at this and see like that's heading. That is surrounded by code that says this chunk of text is a heading. And it's specifically a heading level 1. So this is the parent heading. Anything underneath it that's a heading level 2 is a child of it. So a screen reader would look at that and say, hey, this is an H1. Then it will look at the next thing and say, hey, this is a paragraph. The next one's surrounded by a paragraph tag too. So in coding, accessibility means tagging things correctly so screen readers and other assistive technology can find it. In this case, your brain sees an image. It's a hand with keyboard. Computers aren't quite intelligent enough to interpret that, so we have to use alt text, which stands for alternative text, where in HTML there's an attribute that's alt equals, and then you just put a short description, and we'll go into that in more detail later. So, and this is more of a philosophical, humanizing thing of accessibility, whereas coding accessibility is, hey, let's tag everything correctly. I kind of want to really humanize it, that you're helping people. And you can, even if you yourself, I didn't ask if anybody had disabilities, kind of like probably not, who knows if it's even legal to ask, but you can sort of emulate certain disabilities to kind of get a sense of how difficult it might be to use something. Like this presentation, for example, if you zoom in your browser, like 200%, is it still usable? Is it not usable? What happens if you don't have access to a mouse? Can you still use it just by tabbing in? If you want to watch a YouTube video, unplug your monitor and try to watch the video that way. It's Assistive Technology lets you access all the same content as anybody else, regardless of your disability. And that's kind of the end goal, is that you're not creating a separate site. You're not creating here's our main site, and then here's our accessible B site. You don't want that. And that's what spirit of 508 is, that it should be the same website for everybody. So on that, when I was talking about what the difference between accessibility and Section 508, accessibility in general is the practice of coding your stuff so screen readers can read it. Section 508, I'm not going to go into it in detail. I've been to presentations where they literally go kind of line by line, and you're just dozing off. We're not going to do that. We're not going to do that with the updated law either. But suffice to say, it's federal law, not the same as Americans with Disabilities Act. I think that's a common misunderstanding. It's its own separate thing. It was just updated, which is probably why you guys are here, to kind of see what changed exactly. And as it says here, it's only applicable to federal agencies. So if you're a private company or a nonprofit, it doesn't apply to you. There's exceptions if you're a subcontractor to a federal agency, and there's exceptions on the other side where you don't have to be compliant despite being a government entity for a Department of Defense, for example. So yeah, what changed in 2017? As it says there in a nutshell, we ditched the old law, just kind of completely slash and burn, and put a whole new guidelines that the international European guidelines, which we'll go into that in more detail. I kind of liked the old 508 because it was only 16 things. If you look at the letter of the law, it was super, super long, but there was only one small chunk of 16 paragraphs that applied to websites. 1194.22 was the section. And I kind of liked it in its ambiguity. It infuriatingly said so little about how to accomplish things, but in a way that's good because that allowed everyone to use their creativity to accomplish the goals. It was not prescriptive. It said, a method shall be provided to allow users to skip repetitive navigation. What that method is up to you. The new law, find me afterward, buy me a drink. I'm not a huge fan of it. I think it's overly prescriptive. It ironically might take us backward and make accessibility intimidating, difficult, and costly for agencies. But that being said, this is the law now, so we kind of have to go with it. So here's the kind of nitty-gritty, that the compliance is not required until January 18th, 2018. That may change. The law went into effect in March 2017. And as of now, until January 18th, and that second paragraph I kind of cut and paste from the law, that there's, if your current site is already compliant with the old 508 law and you don't make any major changes to it, you're good to go. But that's, a big if. And I recommend that even if that's true, that you go ahead and try to update your site to the new standards if you only have the old standards. So what is WCAG? So as, to me, it kind of sounds like a cat making a horrible sound. It stands for the Web Content Accessibility. Oops, actually, it's a typo. Guidelines. And it's more complex. It's divided into 3 subsections: level A, level AA, and level AAA. And the current guidelines say you have to be compliant with A and AA. You don't have to do AAA. You certainly could, but that's what the new standards are. So you guys can, I'm going to give you the URL. You can kind of, it's probably hard to see from your screen, but I'll give it to you before you go to check out this presentation in your own time. So, because I have a lot of useful links there. This one I really like as a quick and dirty summary of the existing WCAG, which is exactly the new Section 508. It exactly maps to WCAG A and AA. They basically did a save as and said the new law is copying that guy's homework. So this is your new Section 508. So there's level A here, and then there's level AA. And again, we're not going to go into it in detail. There's not enough time to do all of that. But kind of what I was saying with overly prescriptive, if you kind of go through this, and any of you guys who are experienced in user experience design and UX, you'll probably notice a few of these guidelines go beyond accessibility into UX. That's where I think WCAG fails a bit, is that it's bleeding into other areas and stepping on the toes of other disciplines. That it should have remained focused on pure accessibility. And again, really prescriptive in terms of like how exactly things should be. So, but again, that's the law. So the big takeaway is don't focus on that checklist. You saw that thing, it's like your eyes glaze over. Like I prefer you focus on, I'll show you a bunch of just broad levels accessibility, and if you kind of stick to those things, you're going to make your site super accessible. It's going to cover most of WCAG. A lot of it, like I said, it can't be automatically checked by any system. So, like, that's, just try your best and don't focus on checklists. The goal is to make your site accessible. So, kind of be a little bit of a maverick in that thing. So, what I'm advocating is not comply with 508, but just use common sense. And if you focus too much on checking off every one of those things, you might lose sight of the big picture. And I have a resource here. Have you guys heard of the WebAIM, Accessibility in Mind? I think they're based in Australia. So what they do, they release a survey every year or so, and to like thousands of users of assistive technology, screen reader users specifically. And what I like is how surprising some of the results are. Like everything you thought you were doing right or didn't know you should be doing, screen reader users say like, oh my gosh, this is incredibly frustrating, or this is incredibly helpful. So I highly recommend checking that out and just kind of reading through it. It's divided up here. So there's screen reader survey number 5. I linked to the most recent one, and it's divided up here into sections where you can kind of see what browsers people are using. Kind of a surprising thing, for example, is a lot of users of assistive technology rely on Internet Explorer because it is still one of the most accessible browsers out there. Chrome is kind of crap for accessibility, and most Google products in general, including Android, unfortunately. Apple's really good about it, Microsoft's pretty good about it, but Google is not too good about it. So as much as a lot of designers and developers want people to just, like, oh my gosh, it's such a pain in the butt, it's very accessible. So there's like one of the many surprising things you'll probably see when you go through that thing. So, kind of speaking of that, how do people with disabilities use the internet? Have you guys been to conferences or kind of played with this assistive technology at all? Anyone? A little bit? So if you have an iPhone, it's built into your iPhone. It's pretty cool, and it's built into Android. It's not as good, but it's there. Your Mac OS has it built in. Microsoft Windows Eyes, a lot of technology has it built in, which is pretty cool. And this particular law is specifically referring to economics, Goodhart's law, but it's kind of what I was getting at before, that if you focus too much on complying by the checklist, that's all you're focused on. That's all you care about is, I need to pass this 508 checklist, and then you forget about why you're doing it, which is to make content accessible. So that's like a danger I hope people shy away from. So this is a short video. I hope it plays. It's the blind film critic, and he kind of shows how people use an iPhone to tweet. It's an older operating system that he's showing, but the principles are still the same. Like voiceover is still the same, and there may be an ad. Forgive me if there is. Nope. How do I get volume?
That's a good question.
Well,
Probably
I'm
just
going to
move
show
the
you.
microphone down.
Yeah, there we go.
So a lot of devices have this thing that you probably never even thought to use or check out or anything. It's called accessibility.
Accessibility button.
That will show you all different sorts of things, how to turn the speech on and off your phone to white on black, black and white, maybe mono audio. There's all sorts of different things to do. So I just use the voiceover one, and it works incredible.
Voiceover on button.
But it's a very cool thing, and it allows me to use something that has a touch screen,
104.
just like you do.
Slide or double tap.
So each thing,
Double tap to open.
touch it once, it tells you what it is, twice to perform the action.
Notes. Maps. Stocks. YouTube.
And then to move to the different screens, 3 fingers to go left like this.
Page 2 of full game center.
So let me show you how some of this stuff works.
Twitter. Double tap to open.
So let's. Alright, so let's see what's going on in the Twitter universe today.
Chris Royals. those watching Love Machine, the girl next to me is actually 8 foot tall, which is why I look short.
Why did I tweet something?
What new tweet? Button. Text field is editing.
Alright, so when I tweet, I generally cheat and use Siri. It's easier that way.
Dictate.
Happy Easter, comma, from the blind film critic.
Happy Easter from the blind film critic.
See, pretty innocuous, nice little tweet. So let's put it up.
Tweet button.
One of the things I don't think people get is when you talk to Siri, if you add the punctuation yourself, it works so well. Period.
Kind of stop it there, but like,
I'm going to show you.
so yeah, check it out in your own time. He's got a lot of other great videos. There's another one here that I really love, but we don't have enough time to go over it. This is someone who has severe physical disabilities. He can see, he can hear, he can barely move. It's mostly just his head and a little bit of use of his arms. And then he's able to become a professional video editor because of the accessibility that Adobe has built in. He's certified in Final Cut Pro and After Effects, and the video that is linked here, he did himself, which is really awesome. It's just showing like the, it's beyond a checklist, and it's not even that hard. I think that's the thing I want to take away. WCAG is kind of intimidating, but accessibility is not that intimidating or scary. So that being said, I wish I could do it in super detail and just tell you everything in a ton of detail, but there isn't a lot of time, so I'm kind of probably skip a few sections. And again, this is a resource. I kind of want you guys to be able to, after this, like use this URL, check it out. My contact information is there if you want to like ask questions. But I'll go over what I consider some of the most important things to do. And again, this is part of WCAG. It's not a side of it, but it's things that I think people should particularly focus on when doing accessibility. CAPTCHAs, the WebAIM survey, that's like one of the #1 most frustrating things is CAPTCHAs. It's just, and for those of you who are, everyone who's used a CAPTCHA in general, I'm sure it's not your favorite thing in the world. Basically, don't use it. Rely on Honeypot as much as possible. You will never defeat a dedicated human user who wants to post spam. No matter what your method, no matter if you tell them to like do like a what do you call it, Easter egg hunt, whatever, they will pass it if their goal is to post spam. There's just no way to defeat humans. You will defeat robots, so it's better to focus on methods that are pure robot defeating as much as possible. So we recommend Honeypot and avoid CAPTCHAs as much as you can. Headings, super, super important. Probably one of the most important things. That's how you navigate complex content. So if you've ever been in a Google Doc or a Microsoft Word document and you put your headings in correctly, you can automatically create a table of contents from that. And it's similar in websites. As long as you create your headings correctly, someone using assistive technology can generate a kind of map of that page of all the major heading level 1, kind of like get to a heading level 1 that pertains to their interests, like, register your child for school, go to that heading and start reading the content directly underneath it. So this is one of the most important things, is make sure you have programmatic headings. So that means no bold text, like right there is just bold text. Some screen readers will interpret that as emphasized text, but in general, don't do your headings that way. Use programmatic headings. The nesting doesn't matter as much as you think. It's great if you can try to keep it nested logically, but when you're dealing with a content management system, inevitably you're going to find a few like H3 just kind of floating around H2 that kind of maybe shouldn't be where it is, but as long as it's a heading in general, that's the most important thing. Links, no ambiguous links. That's a huge frustration for users of assistive technology. Screen reader users will often navigate from link to link. They'll obtain an alphabetically organized list of links. So can you imagine the frustration when you have a page that says learn more, learn more, learn more, learn more, read more, read more, read more, read more, that doesn't tell you anything. So you could do the read more as long as you kind of hide the text. Like we've done that before, where you might have a little bit of a span tag underneath around text that explains the link in more context, like read more about our company, and then hide about our company underneath in the span tag, and then on your site it still says read more, but then when you turn off CSS or use a screen reader, it'll see all of the content. So WCAG has, I think, a bit of a disagreement on that. They interpret non-ambiguous as, like, if it says 2017 company annual report. It has a bunch of paragraphs and it says read more. WCAG considers that non-ambiguous because it's the text around it explains it. But with the WebAIM survey, that's not what users who actually use assistive technology consider passing. So take it with you will. It's like a big frustration for users of assistive technology. Images, that's probably the one that people are the most familiar with. When it comes to accessibility, I think you ask anyone, most people know you need to give an image alt text. So the title of this presentation, alt tag, if you're pedantic, is completely inaccurate because it's not a tag, it's an attribute, but I couldn't resist the pun. So it's an alt attribute for the image tag, so the image tag, alt attribute, roughly 100 characters. The WebAIM survey confirms that users of assistive technology prefer brief alt tag. So I think I can kind of turn it on here so you guys can see it. There we go. So right here you see it's probably hard to read because it's so tiny, but it says an image icon showing a mountain landscape. So that's the alt text I use in this particular instance. So you can just keep it brief. If it's a decorative image, like this little arrow, I don't think you necessarily need it. And in fact, I used the background image in that div and just hid text in there. It says previous slide. So I think that's more important than describing an up arrow, so I didn't describe it at all. And Karen's going to go in more details as to techniques for what to do with background images, because those of you who code know background images don't have an alt attribute. So there's other techniques for describing background images when you use it in cards or hero images in your website. But a standard image that's embedded, just alt text, 125 characters. Multimedia is where WCAG goes a little excessive, I think. It's not just closed caption and open caption, it requires audio description. And that's like probably not worth going to at the moment because there's just not enough time, but it's basically you need two separate videos, one that has closed and open caption and one that's audio described. Keyboard accessibility is important, that you don't get trapped in content. If you tab into something, when you press tab on your keyboard and it starts going through all the links, you got to make sure that users aren't trapped in there. And I have a mobile phone in there because sometimes you can get trapped, especially in mobile if you use Apple's accessible voiceover technology and you tab into something using that. You can get trapped in there sometimes, but if you test it on your machine, your desktop, you'll be like, oh, it passes. So I recommend that if you have, if you have the budget for testing, that you definitely test it in keyboard to make sure you don't get trapped. Color, I think that was a big misunderstanding of the last Section 508. There was no color contrast requirements in previous Section 508. WCAG now has color contrast requirements, which are mathematically complex. So instead of trying to figure it out, I have a resource here. Accessible colors. It's really, really good. You input your text color, background color. You need to be, triple or double A compliant with WCAG. If it fails, it'll give you suggestions like either darken the text or lighten the background, and give you the hex value right there to figure it out. So it's a really nice tool to make sure that your stuff's compliant. And I was just having a conversation earlier about how a lot of designers nowadays love low contrast designs like gray text on white, and it's so frustrating. So you can still do pretty design without doing low contrast. It's absolutely not a deal breaker, and you can use low contrast, and that's very low contrast. So white underline I have underneath the URL, but that's okay. It's just a decorative accent. It's not a major thing. The more important thing is that your text is accessible and has high color contrast. Tables is way too complex to go into at this time, but it's tough. Forms I'll skip to in the interest of time. That's self-explanatory. Title tags, just don't do it. They don't help at all. So I think that's a lot of people assume it does. It doesn't. It's basically invisible to everyone. So it's something that's not going to help you too much. And again, Karen's going to go into some nice alternatives instead. All your documents have to be compliant. That's a whole other thing too that I don't have time to get into, but anything you upload needs to be compliant as well, like PowerPoint, Word, Excel. Now, ARIA, this is one of the best things that's happened for accessibility ever. I don't know as much about it as Karen, but it really enhances all of your stuff. You can have like a really badly accessible website, then add ARIA, and just like it becomes good as long as you use it correctly. So I'll hand it over.
Hi everyone. So let's talk about Drupal accessibility. Is Drupal accessible? And it's debatable, but depending on which version you're using, I would say yes. Drupal 8 is definitely more accessible than Drupal 7, and the history behind that was that Drupal 7 believed that the accessibility features should be included on the theme level and not in core. So you had to rely on your themers to include those, and your backend people to include the accessibility. And we've been doing that for a while, but that meant that it wasn't for everyone. It wasn't out of the box. And with Drupal 8, it has become out of the box, so it's much more accessible. So some of the enhancements are that it's become way more semantic. So this is Drupal 8. They've added the ARIA landmarks, live region, and role properties. That means that when a user, when someone with assistive technology is looking at the page, they can understand what the content of the page is quickly, and they can also navigate to where they want to go. And this is a great enhancement over skip links, which just set you past the navigation into the main content. You can actually target different areas of the page, and pages that you get to know really well and their content, you can quickly move through. So, big fan of ARIA, and glad that Drupal 8 has decided to put that into core. Field sets are now using field sets for radio and checkboxes in the Form API, and that means that they'll get the appropriate label associated with their input. And all text is required by default on the images. I haven't talked to people about whether or not this is annoying. So when your content managers are putting in images, they have to put in an alt text. And I just think that's kind of interesting. I'm not sure if people are going to be putting in appropriate alt text all the time. So it would just be interesting to see how that plays out. And there's other features as well that we haven't utilized yet. So the JavaScript oral tours, I believe, we usually turn that off, but there's a voice interaction with Drupal core. And I just wanted to ask a quick question. How many of you guys are using Drupal 7, and how many of you have used Drupal 8 in your sites? Okay. And how many people are afraid or still on 7? Okay, so that was 50%. Hopefully you're not afraid to go to D8 because of accessibility reasons, because it's a really good use case to go into and to update your sites. So I just wanted to talk about our theme, which is Gesso. I said that Drupal 7 was less accessible than Drupal 8. Well, it's not technically if your theme is putting in all the accessibility. So that's what we do with our theme for both 7 and 8. And we try to, we leverage a lot of the stuff that comes with Drupal core if it's in 7 or if it's in 8. And it's open source. So if you'd like to download it, we have a link here to our Drupal page, and we also have it on GitHub. And we also maintain a theme for WordPress as well, which was a really good accessibility win for us, because this meant, so we're using WordPress and we're using Twig on WordPress. And since Drupal 8 uses Twig, we can keep the markup very similar between our different themes, our different platforms. And if we have an accessibility change that we need to push out, we can push it out pretty easily between the platforms. So, it allows us to be quicker with our improvements, so that we can get it out and be as accessible as we can across the board. And I do want to give credit to Dan Moyard. I'm not sure if people are familiar with him, but he is a front-end developer with us, or senior architect, and he was the one who really brought us into accessibility. He's legally blind and legally deaf, and he leveraged a lot of things for Drupal 7 and for Drupal 8, and was involved in the accessibility features for Drupal 8. And he's constantly looking for ways to even improve what's happening with Drupal 8 now. Oh, and I did want to mention that we have signed the Drupal Accessibility Pledge, and I highly recommend using modules and themes that have also signed this pledge, just so that you don't end up throwing a module on your site that basically makes it inaccessible, which can be pretty easy to do. Like if somebody, if you have a form on a module and you put it on your site and it has a high tab index, then you're taking over the tab order immediately. So, yes, these are no-nos and people shouldn't do it, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. So, yeah, I look for folks that are taking that pledge. So, I didn't really get a chance to talk about ARIA, but it is, they have, it's basically a way to take over the markup that where the native HTML isn't working with assistive technology as well as it could be, and I think it's a really great spec. It's W3C, and they have a list of all the roles. Are people familiar with roles? Is everybody using them? Oh, okay. Definitely use roles. So roles are where you identify in your divs what that particular group of content is. So not just your divs, but your HTML elements. So if you have a nav, you would say nav, role, navigation. And if you have a sidebar, you could say div, role. I don't remember what the exact term is, but they have a list. So I recommend going to the ARIA resources and finding that list, and then setting those standardized roles in your markup, and that's going to make it super accessible. And like Daniel's been saying, it's not a WCAG thing, but you're really improving the experience of your users, and depending on what that means to you, like what you'll be missing out by excluding people from using your site. It's it's kind of up to you and your team members. But yeah, highly recommend checking out the ARIA, and we're going to be utilizing it much more. Like we have it, but there's all kinds of things you can do with with interactions on your site. So if you're doing like a crazy data viz with where they can change the state, or change cities, change time periods, you can do that all with ARIA states. So it's maybe people would say why would you have a data viz that was intended for folks with sight disability? Well, you should do it like it's information. That's all the data visualization is. The point of it is to understand certain data, and you don't want to let them be left out just because they can't grab this particular slider and move it over. So that's what I had to say. If you guys have questions, please go ahead.
Back there, I know Amy.
Davey, what was that plugin you were using?
What's that?
The plugin you were using that showed.
Oh, it's should put a link to it. It's Wave. So Wave used to be only for Firefox, and now they have it for Chrome. It's still a little better on Firefox, but it does a good job of it's kind of showing you, here's your alt tags, here's your errors. It's a little too sensitive. It'll be like, here's the 500,000 possible issues that you need to manually check, but it's a nice little quick and dirty tool to see if there's any major issues in your site. So it's a great plugin. It's free, easy to use.
Question?
In terms of the content editor side of Drupal 8, how accessible is that?
That'd be more of a question for you.
So I think that the CK editor that comes with Drupal 8, is that?
Yeah.
Or no?
And sorry, the question was, is the back end for D8, is that accessible?
Yes, I think it is getting there.
Just out of the box, or is it?
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It has keyboard features.
Yeah, from what I've seen, I haven't come into any major issues, and it's at least mildly responsive, right? It's not like fully, like you couldn't necessarily go on your phone and edit the site, but or can you? Yeah, like it's maybe with trial and error.
Yeah.
But yeah,
It's not fully accessible, but they are working on it and giving it a lot of thought.
I think your basic high-end editing pages and things like that, that should be fine. I think it's some of the more complex modules that you're trying to control it may not be as accessible.
Yeah, they definitely did improvements. If you want to check it out, they have a list of the improvements that they made to the admin, which was like everything from adding the keyboard shortcuts to even contrast, because the contrast with that light blue and the white.
So just wondering what sort of for inserting the images into the background.
Oh, that's right. We mentioned that we teased it and forgot to say the exact technique. Like, I can kind of scroll to it while you... Because it's an ARIA thing. Here we go. This is an exact example of a couple of, which is, in the... So I'm going to inspect. So here, it's kind of, I'm sure it's hard to read for everyone, but it says ARIA-label equals.
There we go. So, yep, ARIA-label. So what you would do is, what I've done is taken the image field and grab the text from the image field and then put it into this ARIA label attribute. So you're kind of, you kind of have to do some special coding to make this happen, but it's definitely worth it if you have background images. And yeah, we use background images a lot just because of responsive. Like, it's pretty hard to make and just an image itself be fully responsive, and we like, the shortcuts for that.
And I think an important thing, I think I see a misunderstanding with alt text a lot. I've seen where people will populate the alt text or the label bar with an exact copy, like that paragraph. They'll just copy that exact paragraph into the alt text. Like, no. Like, you're supposed to describe the photo. So you're not using the image as like some sort of alternative to the text next to it. You're describing the photo and succinctly, like this is a landscape outdoor, things like that. And there are exceptions, like you don't want to describe everything with alt text. If it's very decorative, you may not want to. Like, I have an example of a site we built where there's like a background image, but it's more decorative. And it might be hard to see because of the screen, but there's like a fade kind of texture there. I would argue that doesn't need alt text. It's just decorative. But something like this is more of a gray area where that probably does need some sort of description. So you kind of have to use your own judgment on a case-by-case basis as to when you're going to provide a description and when you're not.
What's best practice for maybe a chart that's kind of a complicated chart? So you've already have the description, general description.
Yeah, that's another ARIA to the rescue thing. Like, the charts and graphs and infographics are just built for sighted people. Like, you line up a heading with a cell underneath it. You can tell by the physical size of something that, like, this is where where all the exports came from Mexico or whatever. But when you're talking a screen reader, it's much tougher. So generally, you just want to link to a longer description if possible, using either ARIA. You could use the long desk, which is like built into standard HTML that links to a separate text description. And you could use a combination, alt text that kind of, or an ARIA, either one, that tells what's the point of the chart. Typically, when you have a chart, there's a point that scores are falling, for example. So you get to the point immediately, and then you can link to something much more complex. Like, this shows that in 2017 there was a 3% increase, and so it's a bit of work, but that's generally what we recommend when you're dealing with very complex charts.
So that example you gave before with the ARIA, the description, does the screen reader go through all the attributes, or how does it know to read that description?
I'm not, and I've been cautioned before to don't think you're an expert at accessibility just because you know a screen reader. So I'm like, I'll use VoiceOver a little bit, but I'm by no means an expert. Like I've used JAWS a little bit, so I'm not quite sure. I just like looking at the surveys, when they asked people of assistive technology, they said, when there are ARIA landmarks and ARIA code, do you use it? And they said, yes, whenever it's available, we really like it. So I'm not sure what method they use, if inside the screen reader there's a method to like, hey, it might alert them that, hey, there's a bunch of ARIA stuff, do you want to navigate by it? Because there's like high level where ARIA will label like, this is a header section, this is side nav, this is footer, this is like form controls, and then, describe by for an image, things like that. So yeah, I'm not sure how individual screen readers access the content, but they definitely are apparently. So that's why we highly recommend ARIA. Who was first?
I'm not sure.
Hey, sorry, I think it was back there. It might have been first. But.
I just had a question about animation. So I was under the impression that before the rules were animations can't like autoplay, or you just need a way to stop an animation from happening. So from the transitions on your presentation, would those be considered animations?
It's not as much animation, like the multimedia, this is where it starts to get into gray areas, like, is that multimedia because it's moving, but it's, it's CSS3 animation. And I would argue that does not count as multimedia. The guideline in WCAG is on auto-playing multimedia, like audio especially. So animation, and then there's guidelines as to like, it shouldn't flash, it shouldn't be like to, certain frequencies. I don't think that would violate anything, since I wouldn't count it as multimedia, because then you would be like, I can't use an animated GIF or GIF. Like I know I got half the room angry if I pronounce it, but.
So if you wanted to be able to use it,
What's that?
an animated GIF?
Yeah, I think that shouldn't be a problem. I think audio and multimedia is in videos, and audio is where there's more of a problem, and where WCAG is more specific. Like animations as a whole, because then you could argue like, oh my gosh, the hover behavior, like like I don't know, like you might get too much in the weeds when you start interpreting any movement whatsoever as an animation, or as multimedia rather. And there's back there, I think.
I just have a question. You mentioned a Drupal accessibility pledge. Is there like a list of? Is there a place where you can find a list of all the tickets, or do they just kind of put them in their like modular description that they took the pledge?
So the question was about, is there a list of people who've taken the Drupal accessibility pledge? And I'm not sure.
So would you just, for you to look for it, like is that just something that they would?
Yeah, that's something that would be on the module itself.
Okay.
And that's where I would look for it, like if you're considering using something. But there also might be a list of people that have taken the pledge.
Yep.
The deadline for compliance in 2018, does that apply for PDFs, or do PDFs have to comply back to 2013?
Did you say PDFs? Just
Yeah.
wanted to make sure I heard you correctly.
Yeah.
So you're asking if the guideline applies to, that the deadline also applies to PDFs in addition to websites. Yep, it's everything should be compliant by then.
So people that are asking me, they're migrating new PDFs over to a new website, they're like, how far back do we have to make our documents compliant?
Well, the law in that case, since if those PDFs were compliant with current 508 law, you're fine because you haven't modified them. They're just like a repository. I think it's any new ones after January 2018 that would be required to be compliant. And PDFs are a pain depending on how you generate them. But I recommend that start with Microsoft Word if at all possible. Make sure Word is done correctly, like with headings and linear as much as possible. And that tends to generate a compliant PDF, but like Microsoft Front Page generates really bad PDFs, and anything you save from like a Google Doc is a terrible PDF too. It's terribly broken.
Have you seen anything online that takes into consideration actual font choice for contrast issues or color issues? Everything that I always see is always basic Arial or Times or anything like that, but the world we live in, that's not reality.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the question was, is there any like guidelines for like font size for contrast? Because contrast, you might be like this color, it might pass that site I showed you, but then what if you use this ultra thin font that's like the width of a hair, and technically it's the right color, but now you can't read it. That's difficult to measure. It's another that's another common sense thing, I think, is like sometimes things will pass in that tool, and I'm like, even though it passes, it looks a little hard to read to me. So it's yeah, I don't know of any tool that measures font width, but that's something to take into consideration for sure when you, especially with the DPI of monitors becoming more of a thing, where a skinny font might look great on a high DPI monitor, but then it'll look terrible on a standard definition monitor.
And there's one over there too.
Oh, sorry. Who's over there? So I'll go over there first.
I wanted to mention that webbing site that you showed us actually has a tool that will do the color contrast also with the font size. It's pretty basic. It's like small font size. This won't pass. Large font size. This color will pass. So it does have that in there. I use that all the time. It's really great. But I had a question also, which was like when HTML5 came along and we have like the nav tags and stuff like that. I was under the impression, or someone had told me that like that was supposed to also fulfill the purpose of like the role equals nav. So can you use one or the other, or should you use both, or?
There's no reason not to use both, and I don't think it supersedes either. I think ARIA is much more powerful than standard HTML5. The HTML5 upgrades are awesome, and you could, it's great to use that too. There's no reason to not use both, I guess. I'm sorry, the question was HTML5 and ARIA, because it kind of overlaps a little bit, where HTML5 has the ability to tag something as nav, for example, and ARIA does as well.
I just want to say there is one rule about that, and that's don't change don't change an HTML5 element to something else with ARIA. So if it's nav, make it nav. Like don't make an H2 nav unless you have to. Like there's all these unless you have to. So
Thank you.
And there was one over here.
In terms of making the site responsive and accessible, is there anything special or different about that?
No, it's the same rules apply. I mean, there's more. I think usability starts to become more of a concern in responsive. Like, be careful about relying on hover, for example, because there's no hover on mobile, and sometimes you inadvertently activate hover on mobile just by pressing and scrolling. Like, you might have a hover behavior on your mobile hamburger menu. And then every time a user clicks on the hamburger menu to scroll, they activate the hover, which lights it up, and then it's confusing. So I think it's more usability concerns as you go narrower and narrower than accessibility concerns.
Are you going to share the link to your...
Yes, let me put it up right now. There we go. Thanks for the reminder. Yeah.
One more question?
What are some of the arguments that you can give to someone if they're trying to say, well, we passed this accessibility checker, but you think that maybe the site isn't still accessible? Because like you said before, they're not exactly one-to-one. So if someone's like, well, it passes, then what can you tell them? Like what arguments are best to give them why you should fix it?
It's that's kind of what I was trying to do at the beginning. And the question was, how do you, when somebody says my site passed 508, but you know for sure there's a lot of problems, and they're like, no, here's my checklist, it passed, it's done, it's over, but you could do more. It's like an appeal to emotion. That's a hard thing. That's what I was trying to do at the beginning of you got to make people care, and that's tough, because if all they care about is the checklist, and the only reason they go above and beyond the checklist thing is they actually cared, beyond passing it. I think unless what they checked as passing obviously didn't, that would be it. Then you could use that, obviously, where hey, you said that we passed the alt attribute, but actually there's a ton of background images that should be described that aren't. So in that case, you would use pure logic and pulling up the rules and the laws and things like that. Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, you can either end earlier if anybody else has any more questions or thoughts or comments. And I have business cards up here if anyone wants to be, email more questions. And the presentation itself has links to both of our contact information.
Can I ask you a real specific question?
Oh, yeah.